This week on The Futurists, Adrian Woolfson.
Biology is going to impact everything. Honestly, I think it's going to unlock a multi-trillion-dollar global economy, and any country or nation state that doesn't prioritize generative biology very highly will be left behind.
Hello and welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Robert Tercek, and this week we're going to talk about a different perspective on artificial intelligence. Pretty frequently in the last couple of years, most of our guests have made reference to artificial intelligence, and quite a lot of them talk about some of the changes and maybe the disruptions that will occur, including job displacement. And so there's always this theme of fear and uncertainty or doubt about the advent of artificial intelligence. I don't buy that perspective. I've never bought that perspective. I believe that artificial intelligence is going to unlock tremendous potential. And I think it's going to create great prosperity and great opportunity for those who choose to seek it. This week, we're going to have someone speak to us about another aspect of artificial intelligence that we haven't covered so far on this show. It's the combination of artificial intelligence and other emerging and evolving technologies in the field of biology, which touches about half the economy. And what we're going to hear about today, I think, is very exciting. Our guest this week is the author of a new book. The book is called On the Future of the Species. And I'm very excited to welcome to the show Adrian Woolfson. Adrian, welcome to the show.
Rob, great to be on the show. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm very happy to have you here. I've heard about your book, and of course, this is a topic that we've covered a couple of times on The Futurist in the past. We've had some folks who know about synthetic biology come onto the show. We've also talked about gene editing. But what you're proposing in your book is this fusion of those two technologies, the ability to edit genes, the ability to synthesize new biological material with artificial intelligence. And to my mind, this is one of the most exciting areas for artificial intelligence because it unlocks this grand vista. Frankly, it's taken us into an area that humans have been able to observe but have not been able to explore in a constructive way. Can you give me a little bit of a summary of what the book is about?
Yeah, we've reached this kind of unprecedented moment in not just the history of humankind, but the history of life on Earth, where for the first time ever, evolution by natural selection is no longer the only show in town capable of generating new life forms and new species. And for the first time, humans, in conjunction with AI, have acquired the ability to actually design life from first principles, literally to author it, which goes way beyond editing. When you edit life, with gene editing technologies like CRISPR, you're essentially redlining a document. You're just marking it up, right?
Yeah.
When you're authoring life, when you're actually becoming a writer, a true writer, you're starting with a blank page, right?
Yeah.
And then you're just writing whatever your mind or the AI's mind comes up with, right? So it's a really totally different thing to editing. It goes way beyond. And what it does is it kind of frees you from history, because evolution's explored just the tiniest corner of biological possibility, like a grain of sand in a massive ocean of possibility. And the thing is, though, is once you go down a certain route, you're kind of stuck there with evolution. You can't, you cut off possibilities at each juncture, right? Whereas now, with the ability to write DNA and design it from first principles, you can just materialize anywhere in this ocean of possibility, no longer constrained by historical contingency, because there's a lot of chance events in evolution, and then where you kind of end up, right? So this is a massive, massive difference. Now, I'm not going to claim that, we've mastered this, but what we have done is we've begun to master it, because we can now author viruses from first principles, good viruses, which can help us medically to destroy antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And a virus, of course, isn't technically a living thing. It's a biological entity that requires a bacterial cell to replicate, but it has a genome, right? So if we can design new viruses, then we'll be able to design new bacteria, and then we'll be able to design more complex organisms, and eventually work our way up to, even level of human complexity, right? So my book addresses this new technology, this convergence between AI and the ability to build genomes at scale, and looks at some of the consequences, how it's going to change our life in the future, and some of the philosophical and ethical and moral questions and dangers too, right?
That's right. I'm glad you do. I'm glad you do, because these three technologies in concert confer an immense responsibility on humanity. Essentially, we are now the stewards of our own destiny and, frankly, the planet. I'm not quite sure as a society we're prepared for that. I don't know if we're mature enough to manage that responsibility. There are a tremendous number of decisions that need to be made. And candidly, we can't even figure out how to live on this planet together in peace. So, we haven't demonstrated as a species that we're capable of managing the planet particularly well. And now here comes this incredible technology. It could allow us to reinvent or redesign the way biology works, which is, all the life on the planet. So this is not limited to humanity. I wonder about those ethical issues. So I'm glad that you addressed that head on in the book, because that comes to mind when one reads it. And by the way, for the folks who are listening, I typically read the books before we interview an author on the show. This time I just got the book, and so I've only begun to read it. However, I can tell you already, it's outstanding. I am so excited to read this book. Adrian, I was taking notes on almost every single page, because you have paragraphs where just as you did in the opening statement you just made, where in passing you mention ideas, but those ideas each need to be unpacked. Like, there's so much packed into what you said. Just now, you covered a number of topics that I'd like to circle back to unpack for the people who are listening to the show, because I think they're so very important. And the first one is you made a distinction between reading and writing. So for that, let me offer this. There's a quote attributed to Ernst Rutherford, a physicist, where he says that all science is physics or it's stamp collecting. And that's a very snide and dismissive comment that can never really be attributed entirely to him, because he never wrote it down. On the other hand, it does betray a kind of an attitude that physicists have had about other sciences. And that's because our other sciences are observational. For centuries, we were able to observe. Eventually, we began to classify and organize our understanding of biological structures. But that was about as far as it went. Then we began to understand in agriculture how to do grafting, and that was the beginning of insights into genetics. And so we started to understand there was a system behind this, but it took decades to make progress in that. The big change, I think, comes following the discovery of the DNA as a kind of script for how biological life will unfold. The mapping of the human genome, controversial project, but ultimately it was completed. And from that point on, we were able to read the genome, but not write. So in a way, it's we were illiterate, I guess you could say. I mean, that's a bit of an overstatement, but the idea is that we could observe, we could note, we could classify, but we couldn't really do much with that information apart from passively observing it, or maybe in agriculture managing it a bit, but we didn't really direct it. Once we began to write it, I mean, immediately, that was when we began to think about. When we began to be able to read the genome, that's immediately when scientists began to think, well, what happens if we can write this? Now, that's a pretty big step. I want to, when you said it, you made it seem like, well, we learned to read it and then we can write. There's a number of steps in the process, right? Because it's not just about writing a new genome, it's about synthesizing life. And of course, once you do that, you can synthesize life from scratch. Can you give us a little bit more color on those recent transitions? Because the things I'm talking about now, those all happened in the last 20 or 25 years. So it's relatively recent. And as you say, we're still in the very beginning, the very earliest stages of applying this.
Yeah, and your kind of reference to physics is quite interesting, because of course physics taught us that kind of universal phenomena like the motion of planets and these really high level phenomena can remarkably be explained by incredibly simple laws, right? Kepler's laws or Newton's laws, right? And that was the beauty of physics, that you could define these universal laws which enabled you to predict events which were quite extraordinary, and in the case of humans, eventually land humans on the moon, right? And that's a level of predictability, right? And of course, biology, as Rutherford mentioned at that point, anyway, didn't kind of tick those boxes, right? That it was mainly observational. Linnaeus described all the species, but that was about it. Biology for many years was just about observation, cataloging, describing, right? And then, as you said, eventually humans learned how to also manipulate via crop, the crop improvement, right? Just breeding, interbreeding as well, right? But we weren't able to kind of specifically and precisely control
Yeah.
how changes happened, right?
It
And
was a
so the
kind of
question,
trial and error in a way. All we were just
yeah.
another element in the process of natural selection.
So the question becomes, is it possible, even in principle, to turn biology into a kind of predictive science in the same way that physics is predictive, right? And ultimately, the ultimate prediction is you take a genome sequence, which is just a one-dimensional combination of 4 chemicals, A, C, T, G, and A, right?
Hmm.
And can you go from that to predicting everything about the organism that genome computes, right? Its behavior, its appearance, its development, its life cycle, everything, right? Biochemistry, physiology, right? And the answer has to be that must be possible, right? Because, that's what happens, right? Genomes generate us, right? And therefore you have to believe, right, that there is a kind of grammatical structure in that, written chemical narrative, if you like, which is our genome, that can be understood and unpacked, right? It has to be. That has to be the case, right? So really one then begins to think about biology or DNA in particular as comprising a special type of language, right? And in the same way that English or Spanish or any language you can think of, from Latin to Greek, Russian, all of these languages, human languages, spoken, written, are defined by grammars, right? Because the
Yeah.
grammar determines the rules by which letters are combined and words are combined and sentences are constructed and paragraphs. And that's what enables us to articulate narratives in a coherent manner, right? And
Hmm.
to write books and so on and so forth, right? So the question is, how do we kind of unpick that hidden grammar of biology? We were never given the grammar book, right? We were never given the instruction manual. We
Right.
were just given the end product. And so you have to ask, how do we learn language, right? You and I, right? And the listeners. So you and I, well, me in particular, I mean, I'm assuming you were the same, right? I was never given a book of English grammar and told to read it and learn how to speak English. How did I learn English? By talking and listening, right? It was a kind of organic process. And, my knowledge of grammar is virtually non-existent, So if you said to me, can you give me the breakdown of the grammatical structures that you're using as you speak right now? The answer is no. I've got no idea,
Yeah.
grammatically what I'm doing, but I'm able to do it, right? And AI is able to do exactly that. That's
Yeah.
how AI learns to
Yeah.
speak English, right? It does it by looking at databases of examples of written and spoken words, and it kind of boils out, extracts out those grammatical rules
Hmm.
without actually specifying them. It just kind of learns the patterns, and that's exactly how we learn languages, right?
Yeah.
So the AI can look at these big databases and then use those patterns to kind of then reverse engineer biology, right? And of course, its ability to do that is purely a function of its training set, the data it's trained on. And so far, we've been training AI on just databases of genomes, just
Hmm.
lots and lots of genomes from different species. And that's enabled us, one of my co-founders of my company, Genyro, Brian He, who's at the Arc Institute in Stanford, that's enabled Brian to come up with what's called a genome foundation model, which is a
Oh, really?
type of AI. Think of it as like a chatbot, like Claude or Chat
Yeah.
GPT. But instead of coming up with language. It's coming up with DNA sequences, right? So instead of typing in, tell me the names of the four major capitals in Europe, or give me the names of 20 species of fish, or any question we want to ask ChatGPT, you now tap in, hey, DNA GPT, give me the genome sequence of a completely new species of virus that does this, right? And it gives you the sequence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we're headed, right? Right now we can only do viruses, and we can kind of do bacteria a bit, but we can't do, hey, write me the sequence of a zebra-like creature, or
Right.
or whatever it is, a unicorn, or whatever we want to make, or a bacterium that can degrade plastic, or but eventually we will get to that point, right, where literally we have an interface and we say, hey, build me a genome of a cross between a flamingo and a rhinoceros, and it will say, no, you can't do that. It's not
Mm.
physically, or, hey, yeah, here it is, go build it, right? So that's the kind of design component of biology, the future of biology, being able to make biology into a kind of programmable, predictive engineering kind of medium. The other part of it is to be able to then write that genome. So once you have the sequence, you need to build it, right?
Yeah.
You need to turn it into a physical reality of, chemical reality, right? So
Yeah.
that's the other bit of, you were talking about what's the progress that's enabled us to get to where we are. In recent times, it's the AI,
Mm-hmm.
and the AI was determined by GPUs, which is the physical hardware that enables all of this parallel information to be processed incredibly quickly in an incredibly kind of nuanced way to enable AI to work, because AI has been around a while, machine learning, but what was missing was the compute, right?
Yeah.
So that's the new thing that's enabled it to happen. And then we've developed, another co-founder, Kai-Hang Wang at Caltech, developed this technology called Sidewinder, which enables us to build DNA incredibly quickly, accurately, of any complexity, and at very low cost. So that's the flip side of the coin, right? Design, construct. It's like an architect coming up with an amazing design for an opera house,
Yeah.
but you need to be able to build that opera house, right, in a realistic time frame, at a
That's right.
realistic cost, in a way that looks like the architect's plan, right? So
Right.
you need both of those things. Then you need to be able to boot it up. You need to be able to get the DNA into a cell,
Right.
because
Right.
we don't know how to make cells yet. And then you need to boot it up, like literally get the program running, right? So you need to do all of those things. And in my book, I came up with a name for this whole process. I call it artificial biological intelligence, or
Mm-hmm.
ABI. And ABI is a kind of an extreme form of this capability. Extreme meaning you're totally fluent in the language of DNA, right? You have absolute fluency. So instead of just being able to make a virus, a new species of virus, you can literally make anything, right? So anything you can think of that's physically possible, you could make with biology, right? And using this kind of hypothetical chatbot where you type in what you want. And that's what I call ABI. It's that higher level understanding of biology, which is kind of approaching the status of like a law of physics,
Mm-hmm.
F equals ma, or Kepler's laws, or so there must be rules and laws. There
Right.
have to be in biology, right? And what's missing is just the fact that we haven't kind of discovered them all, right?
Right. I mean, there's
And the
some
funny thing,
examples. Oh, go ahead. Go
yeah,
ahead.
sorry,
I'm sorry,
go.
I didn't
And
interrupt you.
I was just going to say, and the funny thing about AI is that AI does things without us knowing how it does it, right?
Yes. That's
Because it doesn't, because it learns the grammar. But like you and me, if you said to me, Adrian, now, like I said, write out the grammatical explanations of everything you've said so far, I just couldn't do it. I've no idea, right? And AI can't either, actually. It can't give us the explanation of how it does what it does. It just
the
does it.
ultimate black box.
Yeah.
So there are some examples of AI being used in a sort of parallel way, or maybe a similar way. For instance, for protein folding, Another one is for drug discovery, right? This is where we use the immense calculating power of artificial intelligence and computation to calculate all the possibilities in a range. This is something a
Yeah.
human could never do. It would take us years to try to do that, many years to try to do that. But there we have, as a starting point, a tremendous amount of knowledge. Now, the question I have for you is, do we have enough information? Do we have enough data to train this artificial biological
Yeah, no,
intelligence?
you're absolutely right with AlphaFold, which is the AI software, if you like, the algorithm that enables us now to predict protein structure from sequence. That relied on the fact that there was this huge database of
That's right.
crystal structures of proteins, which can be mapped back to the protein sequences. Right now, it's interesting because for many, many years, it's called protein folding when you go from the amino acid sequence to the three-dimensional structure of a protein. That was a massive challenge that nobody knew how you could predict the structure of a protein from just its one-dimensional amino acid sequence, right? And there were many efforts to try and build predictive structures, algorithms, mainly using chemical and physical principles, right? But
Mm-hmm.
none of them work, right? And that's why it was so interesting that the method that did work was when you used no physical or chemical principles at all. You assume nothing. You simply trained the AI with the structures and the sequences, and it
I
learned
see.
how they
I
mapped onto
see.
each other, right? So, and
So
that,
instead of saying to the machine, here's the data and here's the pattern, you say to the machine,
yeah.
here's the data, you extract the pattern, and the machine
You
will
extract
develop.
the pattern.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's and it turned out that it could do that, right? So we can now, with great certainty, predict the structure of a protein from its sequence, right? Including totally artificial proteins. But we still don't know how AI does that, right? And
Mhm.
that there's a whole nother science of trying to understand how AI does what it does, right? But the point is, it's just, in a sense, you could argue it doesn't matter as long as it's able to do it. We don't. It doesn't need to know how it does it, and we don't need to know how it does it. What matters is the result, right? But to answer your question, so that was a perfect example of how having a really good database, very extensive, very high quality data, very high resolution, and very representative data enabled you to get an amazing result. But those kind of databases are few and far between, right?
Yeah.
And they certainly don't exist today. So, in order to kind of get to the next level of ability to design, whatever it is you're trying to design, new species, altered, properties, behaviors, right? We're going to need to define the types of databases that we need, and then we're going to need to build them, right? And it might be
Mhm.
that it's the RNA patterns, the so-called
Yeah.
gene expression. It could be the way the DNA moves around in three-dimensional space and four-dimensional space, because that happens in time, right?
That's right.
In single cells. And I actually think that's going to be a key part of it, is that the DNA has kind of this property of folding and unfolding like proteins, right? And it's kind of like a machine in a way. And the information is kind of also, as well as being in the genes themselves, is also encoded in the behavior of the DNA as a machine
Right.
and how it operates, right? So I
It's not like you
think,
push a button and the thing unpacks.
yeah,
Literally it's almost like an evolutionary process in itself.
yeah.
As an organism grows, the DNA is going to respond, and it's sort of the next stage of growth, or the next stage of formation. Because honestly, it's a mystery to most people how a simple string of, what is it, 20,000 genomes or 20,000 genes in the sequence can unfold and become a human being with free
Yeah,
will
well,
and ability to express.
you have to think about the genes as components, right?
Hmm.
They're kind of unitary components, but it's like almost like a Lego set, right? You can, from a relatively finite number of Lego bricks, you can build so many different things, right?
Right.
And from a set of 20,000 genes, I mean, we share many of our genes with yeast, or many other organisms that, or even a mouse, right?
Yes.
Or a monkey, or
Very
the
humbling.
number of the number of genes are often very similar. Well, they or actually greater, or if you
Right.
take the many plants of genomes that are hugely bigger than ours, right? And the number of genes can be much higher as well. So it's not the number of genes. It turns out that it's the types of genes, but also how those genes are coordinated with one another that enables new properties to emerge,
Mhm.
and you can just tweak, the time that the gene is on or off for, and you can get a totally different outcome in terms
Right.
of the morphology of an organism or whatever, right?
That's
So
important. That's the fourth
biology is,
dimension that you were mentioning a moment ago. It's that time is a factor here because the DNA doesn't operate the exact same way forever. It's not like it's a pattern that
yeah,
just keeps running.
yeah.
It's going to respond as an organism
Well,
grows.
the linguist Noam Chomsky used the phrase that language is able to make infinite use of finite means, right?
Hmm.
In the sense, from 26 letters of the English alphabet, you can generate, all the books that have ever been written and all the books that could ever been written, which is this infinite library, right? And biology does the same thing, with a certain number of genes or a variable number of genes, you can get many different outcomes just by controlling how those genes kind of coordinate with one another over time by switching one on a little bit longer or in a certain pattern. You get very different outcomes. So um, really, the complexity goes way beyond genes. It's
Yeah.
In a sense, it's in the way those genes are programmed by the so-called non-coding part of the genome, which is most of it, which doesn't make proteins but makes RNA molecules that can regulate the way protein encoding genes operate in time and
Let's
space.
hold on that for a moment because I want to talk to you more about the interaction between RNA and DNA, but we'll need to go to a break. Before we do that, though, I thought it might be helpful just to kind of come back to the beginning where I started with that wry quip that's attributed to Ernst Rutherford, which is that physics is the only science and all the rest is stamp collecting. And what he meant was that in many other fields of science, we're doing observation. We're creating, I guess, libraries, or we're creating a kind of index, and you must start there because without that, you don't have the data to feed into an AI system.
Yeah,
So we've been doing
yeah,
that for a long time. We've started to create great libraries of this information, as we pointed out, as you explained. With proteins, we've got the rich database there of high quality data, and that enables AI to go to work. So I think the analogy I want to switch to is a second analogy I wanted to bring up, and I'd like to get this across before we wrap, which is the printing press. Because at one point in the book, you refer to a chemical printing press. You talk about that as synthetic biology is a kind of a
yeah,
chemical printing press that can use the great generative power of biology to reproduce things. Just as the mechanical reproduction of text made it possible for a lot more people to get their hands on books at a much lower price. So
yeah,
we had books for 1,000 years before we had a printing press, and we had scrolls before that, and we had carved tablets before that, but they were very
yeah,
scarce, very expensive. They took a very long time to make because they were handmade, and so the mechanization of the reproduction of information opened that up to a much larger number of people, and that's the sort of origin of modern society. I think that's what people would attribute to
yeah.
Gutenberg's achievement. Do you see something similar occurring here? Does that analogy hold up when we say it's a
Oh yeah,
chemical
yeah,
printing press?
totally. Because you were talking earlier about how did the field start. The field started by making tiny little pieces of DNA, like literally two chemicals joined together. A guy called Professor Todd in Cambridge, and then after that, the first synthetic gene was made,
Mhm.
and that was still a lot of hard work to do that. But over time, what we've seen is a kind of democratization of the technology. Um, in the same way, use the example of the Gutenberg press pre Gutenberg. the only people who could write were monks in monasteries, right? So there were just a tiny percentage of the population
And the
had
only
that
people who
skill.
could read were the clergy, right? Even the
Right,
kings of
yeah,
Europe were illiterate and kind of like,
that's
illiterate
right.
warrior
Uh,
barbarians.
yeah, writing a book was a real big deal, right? Because books were written on vellum, which is the sort of hide of an animal. So you needed about several thousand cows to be killed in order to write one book, right? And it was incredibly slow, expensive, painstaking. If you made a mistake, then you couldn't erase it, right?
You'd scratch it
And
off.
and it was in the hands of a tiny number of people, right? Now with the Gutenberg press, all of a sudden, language or written language could be democratized, right? Because suddenly everybody could read books because they were cheap, they were industrially produced and available, right?
Yeah.
You just had to learn how to read and write. But and I think what's happening with DNA is very similar, right? That we're getting to a point where we can build DNA molecules at scale on an industrial basis, and all of a sudden that gives us this new capability of, once we have AI, of actually bringing designs into reality and turning them into actual and physical entities in a way that's never previously been possible. So in a sense, what we're doing and the technology that was developed at Caltech is like a Gutenberg press for DNA.
Right on. On that note, let's take a break. Folks, you're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek, and this week I'm talking to Adrian Woolfson about his new book on the future of the species. We'll be right back after this break.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurists podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek, and this week I'm talking to Adrian Woolfson, who is the author of a book I've enjoyed immensely. It's called On the Future of the Species. Now, that's a pretty audacious title. I have to say, the notion that you're going to write a sequel to Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species. Did that land well? Are people respectful about that title? It's quite a claim.
Well, I think it's totally appropriate, actually, because Darwin talked about how life began, right?
Yeah.
How the origin of species, and Darwinian evolution's always going to be relevant, but now we're moving to a totally new paradigm, right? Where life can be synthesized de novo. So it is a bold title, but this is in a way bolder than evolution by natural selection, because that's just describing a process that happens. This is where humans literally eventually will learn how to rewrite their own nature if they wish to. I'm not advocating that they do, but I'm just saying, right, that we become the creators of life. I don't use the word God, right? Gods or God, because we're not, right? We can't create universes. We can't, gods or God has many capabilities that we will never have, right? If you're religious, right? But we have acquired a capability that is attributed to divine entities, right? But it's in a very specific domain. And when I say we've acquired the ability in a very rudimentary way, right? But we're learning how to do that. So I think the title is appropriate, and it's a bold title for a bold topic.
And it's also kind of a challenge to the reader, right? It's like, this technology is here, right? It's like Stuart Brand said, it's here. We're getting godlike powers. We might as well get good at managing them. And I think that this is a good call to action. In a way, though, it also, the contrast between those two book titles kind of recapitulates what we've been discussing in the first half, in the sense that until fairly recently, biology was backward looking. It was an observational science. And I think Darwin's Origin of the Species is a good illustration of that. He did an incredibly valuable job of indexing that. So that's the past of biology. And what you're talking about now is the future, which is a human-directed evolutionary process utilizing these technologies.
Yeah, and the word that people use for this new field is generative biology, right? Because we're creating stuff, we're generating new biological entities, new biological species, or totally rewriting them. And as I said, this is very, very different to editing. So I divide the history of biology into three eras, right? One was description, cataloging, and then that ended with DNA sequencing, the ultimate form of, description, right? The actual genetic description, right? And then we moved into the age more recently of genome and gene editing. CRISPR, zinc fingers, talons, those are all different technologies, but that's editing a pre-existing structure. But this third era we're moving into, the era of generative biology, is something that goes way beyond editing. I mean, gene editing is kind of kids' play compared to this stuff. This is something that goes way beyond editing, because editing can only deal with, like I said, pre-existing designs. It's like saying, I can tinker with the engine of a Ferrari, soup it up a bit, right? Or if you're one of those guys who takes a VW Beetle and kind of soups it up, changes, but fundamentally you're still constrained by the original engine, and that's what editing can do, right? But authorship, true authorship, requires a blank page, right? Okay. And that's where we literally take the contents of our imagination or the imagination of AI, because we're not smart enough to do this, right, and start writing our own story.
This is where it really pertains to futurists and future-minded thinking, in the sense that, quite a lot of people, when they're presented with a brand new concept or a brand new idea, they'll say, oh, that'll never happen, or people will never go for that, right? There's a kind of I've noticed a built-in reflex that many people have. Their first impulse is to say never, but never is a very long time. And these days, especially because we seem to be accelerating technological advancements, it's a little risky to use the word never. It might be, implausible. That's different from never. There's another frame of mind, though, that futurists use. What a future-minded person will do is say, instead of saying, well, that'll never happen, they say, well, how might that happen? What are the possibilities that might make that available to us? What would that look like? What would have to happen? Or they might ask another question, well, what's stopping us? Now, that question's often asked in a sarcastic way, what's stopping you from doing it? But what I mean here is if you ask it in a constructive fashion, what's stopping you actually gives you a roadmap for improvement, because you can say, well, we've got these pieces, but we need these other pieces. That's what's stopping us right now. Well, that's a roadmap for invention and discovery. And many technologists use that. They'll say, gosh, with the capabilities we've had, they can envision the next step, but that has to be built. So they do it, and then that opens up a whole vista of adjacent possible steps. And I think that's what we're describing here. Let me try another of my ham-fisted analogies here. So we talked about the printing press, but I think that's a little bit facile. I want to get a little bit more specific about that. You need the ability to read. Then you need the ability to write. Then you need the ability not just to write by hand, but to do it mechanically by typesetting. And that's the printing press. That's the mechanical reproduction, which means that you're not writing a single copy. You can create multiple copies. So now you're into manufacturing. Of course, in the modern era, we don't do it that way. We use a computer, right? And so instead of writing by hand on a piece of paper, you type on a computer, and that text is represented as, it's code, but it's represented in readable text. And then you have a word processor, and this is where I think CRISPR fits into the equation. That's really how the word processing part is where we're making advances in gene editing. But you're still not done. You still need a printer. And this is where we need things like genome compilers, where you can go from, here's the script, here are the instructions, but I don't have a new plant, I haven't changed anything in the real world yet. I have to translate that from instructions into the real world. This is the part where I think people get a little bit lost, because we're talking about going from, everyone can understand how you go from, a written word to something on screen on a word processor, then you press print, and there's a printer nearby that turns that code into words on a piece of paper to go from the digital to the physical. But I think a lot of people get lost about how that occurs in biology. How do you go from a script, from code, from software that's on a computer, How do you synthesize amino acids into a sequence? Is there a kind of printer? Is there a genome printer that's
Yeah.
available?
Yeah, well, we do it at the DNA level, and then the DNA is used to make proteins. And
So
yeah,
like building blocks.
yeah. So basically, when you're kind of walking down the road one weekend on a Friday, and you see a kind of empty car park where it's a kind of building site, and then you see that they have these prefabricated kind of concrete structures and loaded onto a lorry, and you come back Monday and they've just kind of connected them all up, right?
Yeah.
Throwing them together. And if you build houses like that, you can do it real fast, right? Instead of brick by brick, you've just
Yeah.
got these prefabs. And so
Yeah.
we've invented my co-founder at Caltech invented, Kai Hang Wang, a kind of way of building DNA a bit like that, right?
Mm.
Assembling very big pieces of DNA from lots of small parts very efficiently and very rapidly and at very low cost, right? The technology is called Sidewinder, and we license that into our company, Genyro, right? And that's, really the kind of technology that you're referring to. It's a technology that can build big pieces of DNA very, very rapidly and efficiently and super accurately and at super low cost, right? And that kind of democratizes DNA construction in the way that you were talking about earlier, and enables you to physically build DNA molecules at scale, right? So it's quite unprecedented.
That's cool.
Because
So
otherwise,
these are like prefabricated parts, if you will, like prefabricated
well,
building
you
blocks.
start off with a bunch of prefabricated parts, and then you just connect them up, right? And we've invented a kind of method that's based upon page numbers, right? So the publishing industry took 90 years to discover the concept of a page number, right? The first Gutenberg Bible actually did not have page numbers, right? So if that book fell apart, the only way to reassemble it would be to read the beginning and end of each page and kind of match them up, right? But sadly, a lot of the human genome and plant genome is very repetitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't match up those pages. That strategy wouldn't work very well at all. So what did the publishing industry solve that problem with page numbers? And actually, what we've done is we've introduced the concept of page numbers into DNA for the first time ever. Nobody's ever done that before. It sounds crazy that they haven't, but a lot of good inventions are kind of obvious once you've thought of them, right? That nobody had, right? So what that means is we can take literally thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of DNA fragments and instantaneously assemble them into the right order with only a 1 in 10 million error rate, which functionally is zero when you're dealing with 100, right? And
It also means the machine could do that. Then the machine could do the assembly very rapidly. So that gets you to the mechanization and the mass production.
That's right. Yeah. So we can do this incredibly efficiently now and very, very accurately. And that's where you get the scale from.
Do you model it first? Do you do like a simulation before you build?
It's just that they literally press a button on the computer and it's all worked out for you.
Oh wow!
That's how it is.
That's what Genyro does. Your company Genyro is in that business.
Yeah, that's what we've developed, is the technology that does that. Yeah, and we're licensing it to a bunch of pharmaceutical companies, vaccine companies, DNA engineering companies.
Well, let me talk a little bit about that, because it'd be interesting to talk about the practical applications. And before we jump into that, I think. Well, no, let's do that. Let's talk a bit about that. So, pharmaceutical, obviously, these are companies that are already using AI to do. They're using artificial intelligence to do drug discovery, and this would fit into that general thrust that they're trying to do. They're always trying to find novel compounds that might solve a problem. But we have to stop for a second and think that about half of the global economy consists of products that are derived from biology, and it's not just pharma, but it's all of healthcare. It's 20% of our economy. Most energy, all fossil fuel, is also derived from very ancient life forms. All of our food, which is another quarter of the economy or 20% of the economy, is also generally very little of it is synthetic. And so Here we have a huge chunk then of the economy is derived from biology. But we don't tend to think of it that way because we consume it as finished packaged
Yeah,
products,
yeah.
of course. Are you active in all those areas? I would imagine that manufacturers in all those areas are interested in your technology.
Yeah, we're licensing our technology to a lot of people, and some of the areas we're doing ourselves. Um, and really, you touch upon another point, which is that I believe that biology is going to become infrastructure, right? Everything you can think of will be made biologically, which is great because biology is sustainable, right?
Yeah.
And it also has unique properties like intelligence, right? So you can embed intelligence into materials if you want to, right? Or into objects, or, so it gives you this incredible new property that no other current material has.
I'd
No
go further.
materials
I'd
have
say
intelligence.
that biology has this immense generative capacity. Just it's an immense generative capacity, and you cannot stop it, right? So if you have if you just throw some old food outside, it's going to grow into something sooner or later, right? So it's not an
Yeah,
unstoppable process, and most human manufacturing is still inefficient. Most of the energy that we use, we lose in the process, just in the mechanics of using the energy. Nature doesn't work that way. Biology is incredibly efficient, and parts that are,
yeah,
life forms that die, they get reused, they get broken down and reused into something
yeah,
else. So it's also sustainable and renewable in ways that human manufacturing is not. So the ability for humans to master that immense generative capacity, I think, is a tremendous unlock for humanity, and in ways that most people haven't, I think, yet begun to realize the consequences of.
oh
Um,
yeah.
there are
No, I mean,
costs at every level. Right? There's inefficiency at every level of human manufacturing and the human
yeah.
supply chain.
Oh, totally. I mean, and biology is going to impact everything. Honestly, I think it's going to unlock a multi-trillion-dollar global economy, and
Hmm.
any country or nation state that doesn't prioritize generative biology very highly will be left behind. The future is in front of us, ready to grasp. But if we don't grasp it and make sure we invest appropriately and become the world leaders, we will not own the future. Whoever owns this technology owns the future. It's going to be a massive multi-trillion-dollar global economy, with biology being used for pretty much anything you can think of, from information storage to food production to unique biomaterials to healthcare. It has an incredible utility across every key sector, and is going to be absolutely critical to the future economy.
Adrian, while people are listening to this, I'm imagining that some people are hearing this message and they're hearing it a little bit differently than the way you and I are enjoying it right now, which is
Yeah,
they're scared. They hear about this and they
yeah,
say, that sounds scary. And they say,
yeah,
gosh, these are humans talking about assuming godlike powers, but we don't have the
yeah,
governance mechanisms right now. And
yeah,
even
yeah,
some of the things that you said, I'd like to give you a chance to come back to and kind of unpack for the audience that's listening, because you talked a couple of times about viruses that can be designed. And of course, when
yeah,
most people hear viruses, they think a virus that's going to infect us or a virus that's going to, transmit a disease to us. And I think what they're missing or may not be aware of is that a virus is just a really well adapted mechanism for the delivery through a biological pathway of a payload of some sort. It could be a positive or negative payload. The way we mostly are aware of it is
yeah,
when we get a cold virus, and we get the
yeah.
cold. So we have a negative association. But I think the way you're looking at it and the way you're describing it is you're more interested in this highly efficient, evolved mechanism for the delivery of a biological payload. Can you please explain that perhaps a little bit better than I just did so that our audience can understand what you mean by a designed virus?
Yeah, a designed virus is when you literally think about the properties you want to optimize for, and then you optimize for them, right? So in this case, Brian was interested in a type of virus called a bacteriophage, and they literally, the word phage is derived from a Greek word which means to eat, right? And these viruses literally infect bacteria and destroy them, right? So actually, it was the Russians who really developed this field many years ago, which was to use these bacteriophages as antibiotics because they infect and destroy bacteria. So once that was realized, a large amount of work went into seeing whether you could use these phage as basically antibiotics. And actually, in Russia for many years, the Russians never wanted to use antibiotics. They saw it as antibiotics as a sign of the decadence of the West, and they refused to buy antibiotics for a very long time, and fell behind in that area, right? But the point is that bacteriophage can kill bacteria that are multiply resistant to antibiotics. And what Brian my colleague, did at the Ark Institute in Stanford is he engineered the genome of these viruses to compute variants which were different enough to be called new species because they technically met the criterion of a new species. And he was able to kind of rev them up, if you like, so that they killed bacteria that were resistant to antibiotics more efficiently than the kind of parental strains, and thereby showing that bacteriophage, when engineered, can be a new class of antibiotic, right?
That's great because we need that. We have so many methicillin-resistant bugs that are we're kind of breeding superbugs.
So we were using this for a good purpose, but you're absolutely right that the same technology, if in the wrong hands, could be used for a bad purpose, right? It could be used for bioterrorism, biowarfare or whatever, right? And so that's why it's so important. And the final chapter of my book's called A Manifesto for Life. And in my Manifesto for Life, I address actually many aspects of this topic, and in a way that kind of says that this is what I think should happen. Like, I don't believe that we should try and change human nature. I think we can get rid of diseases, we can extend our healthy lifespan, but there have to be some limits to what we do, right, in my view. And I set those limits as not changing our nature, right? Not changing our basic humanity. But in the future, that it may well happen because, opinion evolves over time. But one key theme of my book is one that we should treasure nature as it exists. So paradoxically, synthetic biology and artificial biological systems can help us to preserve nature, because if we destroy our planet a little less, right? For example, we use 10% of the global energy to store information, right? And most of that information is never retrieved. Like, how many photographs do you have on your phone that you will never look at ever again, right? Will you delete them? No, because you might just want them one day. Same is true.
Why not encode them in a drop of DNA and I could have them forever?
Yeah, that's right. And you won't have to use 10% of the world's energy, right? So similarly with plants, right? If you could make plants drought resistant, heat resistant, and so on, pest resistant, then we wouldn't have to worry so much about cutting down all the rainforests to make more land for crops, because
pouring chemical fertilizer on the soil, that runs into the water.
Because you'll be getting a 10x production on your crops.
So the next green revolution will come from this sort of synthetic biology.
Totally, it's going to come from synthetic biology, and we've already designed an artificial chromosome for plants. Now, people say to me, people don't even eat GM food, gene-edited food. Why then? How do you ever think anybody is ever going to eat a plant with an artificial chromosome? And you know what the answer is? You may not have a choice, because you're going to need to eat, right? And that's the point. We need to ramp up food production dramatically.
Right. Andrew Hessel, our mutual friend, had said to me, he said, synthetic biology makes GMO irrelevant. It's not just an alternative to it. It's a replacement for GMO. You don't need to do the genetic modification. I want to continue on this theme of the possibilities. One of the points you make in the book quite eloquently is that humanity and broadly biology, life on this planet, has been constrained by two variables: chance and selection. And this is going to free us from those constraints, because now we're the stewards, right? We're the director. We're the author of life. We're able to say, no, we choose to go in this direction. Now, we may still be subject to elements of chance and selection, but we're directing it. This is like a human-directed evolution. That sounds like an incredible upgrade for humanity if it's applied in a positive way, right? That seems like a really exciting possibility for the future. And one of the possibilities you describe in the book is that we might invent entirely new species from scratch. So in closing, tell us a little bit about that prospect, because I think that's a very exciting and maybe to some people a little bit uncomfortable.
Well, look, it goes back to my earlier point about biology having only explored a very tiny bit of possibility, right? So imagine if evolution had gone in a different direction, right? And never discovered maize, never discovered the potato, never discovered the tomato, never discovered the rubber plant, right? All of these things, never discovered a chicken or a cow or a goat or any of these species that are such an integral part of our life, right? So now imagine that there are other species out there just like that, right? That we've never discovered that could have a tremendous impact on our ability to get food security or our ability to build stuff or do things, right? So I can guarantee you that there are huge numbers of such species out there in the kind of mathematical world of possibility. And, so this technology enables us to discover those things, which may have been totally cut off from what's possible by the fact that evolution went down a certain route. Now, we need to be super careful how we manage these things, because the introduction of foreign species into new environment or existing environments can be catastrophic, right? Because you change the whole balance of the ecosystem. And just generally in my book, one thing I say throughout, right? We need to preserve nature, but we need to ensure that we use these technologies safely, responsibly, reliably, ethically, in a morally consistent and kind of decent manner, and in an equitable manner, and in a manner that benefits society.
So, folks, we've been talking to Adrian Woolfson. He is the author of On the Future of the Species. And this is my favorite book of the year. I've enjoyed it so much. And Adrian, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for taking time to acquaint us with your work.
I'm really pleased to hear that, Rob. Thanks so much. I'm delighted.
It really is an excellent book. As I said, I've just begun reading it, so I'm only a couple chapters in. I've already unpacked so many exciting ideas, and I encourage everybody on this call to consider ordering it. It's an excellent book. Thank you very kindly for joining us on The Futurists this week. And folks, we'll be back next week with another person who is shaping and influencing the future with their work. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks so much, Rob. Real pleasure talking to you.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.